The train station loomed like the husk of something long abandoned, yet unwilling to decay. Graffiti marred the cracked brick walls, and weeds curled through gaps in the pavement like skeletal fingers. Josh adjusted his camera, scanning the empty tracks while Dave tested the microphone. "This place is dead," Dave muttered, panning his flashlight across the vacant platform. The light barely penetrated the suffocating darkness beyond the tracks. "Not for long," Josh murmured. According to the legend, the midnight train was a phantom, an impossibility. Those who saw it rarely spoke of what happened afterward. Some simply vanished. Others were found days later, lost in the city with no memory of how they got there, their eyes dark hollows. Josh and Dave had debunked dozens of ghost stories, but this one, it felt different. The air was wrong, thick, expectant. Even the streetlights bordering the station seemed hesitant, flickering in and out of existence. They set up their cameras, positioning them toward the rusted tracks. The silence stretched, the anticipation gnawing at Josh's ribs. Then, a distant whistle cut through the stillness. It didn't echo like a normal sound. It curled through the air, resonating deep in their bones. Josh's breath hitched. The tracks, empty just seconds ago, hummed as if something massive approached. "There's nothing there," Dave whispered, eyes locked on the empty rails. And then there was. The train appeared without arriving. 1 second, the station was empty. The next, a sleek metallic train stood waiting, dark windows gleaming beneath the flickering station lights. It wasn't old or rusted. It was pristine, impossibly clean, as if it had been polished for centuries, waiting for this moment. The doors hissed open. Josh exchanged a glance with Dave. This was the moment they were here for. If they hesitated, the train might disappear. If they hesitated, they might never get another chance. Dave exhaled sharply. "We doing this?" Josh nodded. He lifted his camera and stepped onto the train. The floor was cold beneath his boots, almost damp. A sickly sweet scent clung to the air like decayed flowers. Dave followed. As soon as his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them. The sound was final, like the slamming of a coffin lid. Josh turned, pressing his palms against the sealed doors. Dave?" Outside the windows, the station blurred, not as if the train was moving, but as if the world itself was unraveling. The tracks, the buildings, the sky, everything peeled away, leaving only a swirling void of absolute darkness. The train lurched forward, and there was no going back. Josh pressed against the doors, palms flat against the cold, metallic surface. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. "Try the emergency button," Dave said, voice tight. Josh's fingers fumbled for the panel near the door. The red button sat there, dusty, neglected. He pressed it, hard. Nothing. A hollow click, no alarm, no response. Dave tried the intercom. "Hello, anybody there? We just, need the doors to open. Now." The speaker crackled to life. Static. Then, a click. Something was listening. Josh shuddered and turned away from the door. His breath came short and fast, as if the air in the train had thinned. The interior was disturbingly clean. No graffiti, no signs of past passengers. Just long rows of faded seats, the fabric peeling in places, shadows pooling beneath them like ink spilled from a nightmare. "Where's the conductor?" Dave asked, scanning the length of the car. Josh tried to steady his breathing. "Maybe in the next car?" His fingers trembled as he lifted his camera. The small red light flickered, recording every eerie detail. Outside the windows there was nothing. Not the city, not the station, not the world. Only blackness, churning like something alive. Josh's stomach twisted. He'd expected eerie, expected unsettling, not this. This wasn't just an abandoned train. This was a thing untethered from reality, moving through a space that wasn't supposed to exist. The floor beneath their feet trembled, as if something deep beneath them breathed. "Okay," Dave exhaled. "Okay, man, what do we do?" Josh turned to the door again, gripping the edges, pulling hard. The metal was ice cold, unyielding. It was as if the doors weren't locked, but welded shut by reality itself. The lights flickered overhead. Josh froze. The bulbs buzzed, throwing erratic shadows across the seats. And then, a new shadow flickered on the wall, not theirs. It stood in the aisle, just beyond their field of vision, long-limbed, head tilted, still, watching. The train gave another shudder, the sensation traveling through the floor and into their bones. Josh swallowed hard. "Dave?" Dave turned and froze. There was nothing there, just empty seats. And yet, Josh could still feel it, that presence, lurking, waiting, watching. The train wasn't just moving forward, it was waking up. Josh's grip on the camera tightened. The train car stretched out in front of them, row after row of empty seats, the dim yellow overhead lights casting weak halos across the dust-laden fabric. Dave took a slow step forward, the floor beneath him groaning softly. "We need to check the next car," he muttered. Josh nodded, forcing his feet to move. The sense of being watched gnawed at his nerves. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, his camera aimed down the aisle. The screen flickered for a moment, static crackling across the image before stabilizing. Then Dave cursed under his breath. Josh looked up. 3 rows ahead, a man sat slumped in one of the seats. He hadn't been there before. His posture was unnaturally stiff, hands folded neatly in his lap, head bowed, the brim of a dusty hat obscuring his face. His coat looked old, the fabric brittle, as if left in a closet for decades. Josh's breath hitched. Did you see him sit down?" Dave shook his head. Josh raised his camera again, zooming in. The figure remained motionless. The train rocked slightly and the seats creaked, except for his. "Hey, sir," Dave called hesitantly. "Are you okay?" No response. Dave took a slow step closer. Josh's pulse pounded against his skull. Something felt wrong. Not just the silence, not just the impossibility of the man's sudden appearance. It was the air, the way it seemed to warp around him, like heat distortion on pavement. "Dave," another creak. Josh turned. A woman now sat 5 rows back, head turned slightly toward them. Her dress was old-fashioned, tattered at the edges. Long, stringy hair obscured her face. Josh's stomach twisted. She hadn't been there a second ago. Dave spun, his voice caught between a gasp and a curse. "They weren't." Josh blinked. And in that blink the man had moved. No longer slumped, he was now 2 rows closer, his head still bowed. Another blink. The woman was closer, her hands resting lightly on her knees, fingers impossibly long. Josh refused to blink again. The lights overhead flickered, buzzing like insects trapped in glass. A low creak rippled through the seats, like bodies shifting all at once. Josh's hands trembled. The camera's screen flickered again, distorting, warping. And then a shadow rose at the end of the car. Tall, gaunt, watching. The conductor had arrived. The shadow stretched impossibly long down the aisle, rippling across the faded seats like a living thing. Josh's stomach twisted as his camera flickered again, struggling to hold on to reality. At the far end of the car, the conductor stood waiting. His uniform was crisp yet faded with time, the buttons gleaming dull bronze in the dim light. His frame was wrong, too thin, too elongated. The longer Josh stared, the more it seemed like the uniform was the only thing holding him together. His face, sunken, hollow, too wide. A lipless grin stretched impossibly across his face, exposing yellowed teeth that looked more like splinters than bone. His eyes, or the spaces where his eyes should be, were nothing but twin voids, deep and endless. The train lurched, sending a wave of nausea through Josh's stomach. He grabbed the nearest seat to steady himself, but Dave took a step back. The conductor didn't move, yet in the next flicker of the lights, he was closer. Josh sucked in a sharp breath. His fingers fumbled at his side, searching for his camera's zoom function. But the second he blinked, closer. The conductor now stood just a few feet away, his head tilted, the grin widening, though he made no sound. He simply watched. Then he raised one skeletal hand. Josh's chest tightened as he saw what the conductor held. 2 tickets. The slips of paper were thin, almost translucent, their edges fluttering despite the dead air inside the train. The symbols scrawled across them weren't in any known language, shifting as Josh's eyes tried to focus. Dave clenched his jaw. What happens if we don't take them? The conductor's grin did not falter. His arm remained extended, the tickets trembling between his fingers. Josh didn't want to find out what happened if they refused. His gut screamed at him to run, to find another way out, to escape before the train took them somewhere they could never return from. But his hand moved on its own, fingers brushing against the paper. As soon as he touched it, a piercing cold shot through his arm, sinking into his veins like ice. A rush of air filled his lungs, but it wasn't air at all. It was something else, something stolen. His breath weakened, his vision swam. He felt his pulse slow. The conductor reached for Dave. Dave jerked back, but it was too late. The conductor punched the ticket. A sharp snap of air, like something breaking. Josh gasped, clutching his chest. A piece of him had just been taken. The conductor pocketed the stubs, satisfied. His skeletal grin stretched further. Josh's ears rang. His body felt lighter, hollowed out, like a part of him had just ceased to exist. Then, the overhead screen flickered, the digital letters shifting between legible locations and jagged alien symbols. The train wasn't stopping. The PA system crackled to life. A voice, distorted and wrong, rasped through the speakers. Next stop, forever. Josh clutched his chest, his breath still shallow from whatever the conductor had just taken. His limbs felt lighter, but not in a good way, like something essential had been pulled out of him, leaving only a fragile husk behind. Dave gripped his shoulder. "You okay, man?" Josh swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, I think so." It was a lie. He felt less. The conductor stepped back, his skeletal frame barely shifting as he melted into the flickering shadows. He had what he wanted, for now. Josh and Dave turned their attention to the overhead display, the screen jittering between locations. Union Station, Central Terminal, Nowhere, Forgotten Place, Never Left. Each name lasted only a moment before morphing into something else, as if the train couldn't decide where it was supposed to be. Josh clenched his fist, trying to steady himself. "This train isn't stopping, is it?" Dave exhaled sharply. "Nope." The intercom crackled again, the sound crawling beneath their skin. A voice, not quite human, spoke in a fractured whisper. "We see you." Josh's stomach twisted. The other passengers, the ones who had appeared out of nowhere, began to mutter. The man in the brimmed hat rocked forward slightly, his fingers twitching on his lap. His lips moved, forming words that Josh couldn't understand. The woman with the stringy hair let out a slow, wheezing breath, her head tilting ever so slightly. Their voices weren't distinct. They overlapped, bleeding into each other, forming an unnatural, rhythmic chant. It wasn't a language Josh recognized, but his body reacted to it. His stomach twisted, a deep nausea rolling through his bones. It felt like his mind was being stretched, reshaped. Dave covered his ears. "Josh, we have to move." Josh nodded, but his legs refused to cooperate at first. It felt like the air inside the train was thickening, pressing down on them, slowing them. The windows rattled. Josh glanced outside, expecting the same swirling darkness. But something had changed. The void was no longer empty. Shapes moved within it. At first they looked like shadows, featureless, shifting things. But then one of them pressed against the glass. A hand, blackened and stretched too thin, dragged its fingers down the window pane. Another face surfaced, a reflection with no eyes, no mouth, just smooth nothingness staring straight at them. Josh took a step back. Dave cursed. "Screw this, man. We need to find another car." Josh nodded quickly. "Agreed." The muttering from the passengers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a grotesque harmony. The conductor remained where he was, his grin never faltering, his hands clasped behind his back as if he had all the time in the world. Dave grabbed Josh's sleeve and pulled him toward the sliding doors at the end of the train car. They didn't stop to check if anyone followed. Josh shoved the door, and it opened. The next car was pitch black. A single light flickered overhead, revealing something piled in the aisle. Josh's stomach dropped. They weren't alone in here. And the things left behind told them they weren't the first. Josh and Dave stepped cautiously into the darkened train car, their breaths shallow. The moment the door slid shut behind them, the sound of chanting from the previous car was abruptly cut off, replaced by silence. Not the comforting kind, the kind that carried weight, as if something unseen was holding its breath alongside them. Josh flicked on his camera's night vision. The screen flared green, revealing rows of abandoned belongings. Backpacks slumped against the seats, cell phones with shattered screens, jackets draped over armrests as if their owners had simply stepped away and never returned. Dave exhaled sharply. What the hell? Josh crouched near a dusty purse, nudging it open with one gloved hand. Inside, a driver's license peeked out, its photo faded, the name worn away by time. "This stuff's been here for years," Josh muttered. Dave reached down, picking up a cell phone half buried under an old duffel bag. The screen was cracked, but when he tapped it, it turned on. Josh's breath hitched. "That's not possible." The phone's lock screen showed a missed video call. The timestamp read 12 o'clock a.m., the exact time they had stepped onto the train. Then, without warning, the screen flickered and a video began playing. Josh and Dave leaned in. The footage was grainy, recorded in low light. It showed a man, sweaty, wild-eyed, staring into the camera. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Don't look at them. Don't speak to them. No matter what they do, no matter what they say." His words cut off as a shadow loomed behind him. Josh's stomach twisted. The figure wasn't human. Its shape rippled like smoke, eyes burning black voids. The man turned, his face contorted in horror. Then, the screen glitched. Static rippled across the display. For half a second, an image flashed. The same man, but now he was different. His eyes were gone. His skin had turned ashen and sunken. His mouth locked in a twisted grin. Then the screen cut to black. Josh and Dave stood frozen. The silence pressed in. Then the phone screen lit up again. A new video file appeared. Dave hesitated, then pressed play. The screen showed Josh and Dave, right here, in this train car. Josh's throat went dry. The footage showed them as they were now, standing amid the abandoned belongings, except in the recording. There was someone standing behind them. A shape loomed in the darkness, too tall, too thin. Its arms hung too long, its fingers brushing against Josh's shoulder. But he felt nothing. Dave whipped around. Nothing was there. The phone shut off on its own, plunging them back into silence. Josh exhaled shakily. "We need to keep moving." Neither of them looked back as they hurried toward the next door. Behind them, a bag rustled, as if something had just moved inside it. Josh and Dave didn't look back as they forced the next door open. The hinges groaned like something in pain, resisting their escape. Beyond the threshold, the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, an endless corridor of glass lining both sides of the car. But outside there was no night sky, no station, no cityscape. At first the black void churned, as it had before. But then something changed. The darkness peeled away, revealing impossible places. Dave took a slow, shaky step forward. Josh barely heard him. His eyes were locked on the windows, on the new worlds rushing past them. To his left, a city of floating buildings loomed against an ashen sky. The structures were impossibly twisted, spirals of metal and bone fused together. In the streets below, figures walked, but they weren't normal. Their limbs were wrong, their movements unnatural. And then, as one, they looked up at him. Josh's breath caught in his throat. They weren't just looking through the window. They were aware of him. Their mouths unhinged in eerie synchronization, stretching wide as if screaming, but no sound came through the glass. Dave grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the opposite side. "Don't look too long." Josh tore his eyes away, turning toward the right side windows, and wished he hadn't. The scene outside had changed. Now they were rushing through a barren wasteland, a desert stretching endlessly beneath a blood-red sky. Something moved in the sand, figures dragging themselves forward on elongated limbs. One of them lifted its head. Josh's legs nearly gave out. The creature's face was his own, not just similar, not just a look-alike. It was him, his own expression, his own eyes staring back. Except this version of him was hollow, starved, with skin pulled tight against bone. His other self reached out, fingers scraping against the invisible wall of the window. The train lurched. Josh stumbled back, tearing his gaze away. Dave's breathing was ragged. "What the hell is this?" Josh forced himself to look at one last window, and immediately wished he hadn't. They were now passing through a ruined landscape, a train yard filled with the wreckage of countless other trains, all burnt-out husks, their metal skeletons twisted into grotesque shapes. Beyond them something stirred, a colossal silhouette rising in the distance. Its eyes were hollow voids, its body shifting like something not meant to be seen. It watched them, and then it started moving toward the train. Josh's chest tightened. "We have to go, now." They bolted for the next door, the echoes of their footfall swallowed by the humming of the train. As Josh reached for the handle, the windows behind them shattered inward. But not with glass, with hands. Josh and Dave shoved the door open, practically throwing themselves into the next train car. The hands, pale, blackened, wrong, had torn through the shattered windows behind them, reaching into the space they had just occupied. The moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut on its own. Josh twisted around, breath ragged. The glass was whole again. No broken shards, no hands clawing inward. Just an endless corridor of pristine windows, as if it had never happened. Dave swore under his breath, hands on his knees. I don't understand." Josh barely heard him. He was staring ahead into the new train car they had just entered. His stomach dropped. They had stepped back into the same train car, the one they had just left. Every detail was the same: the faded seats, the flickering overhead lights, the buzzing digital screen. The passengers were no longer scattered. They were all facing them now, every single one. The man with the brimmed hat, the woman in the tattered dress, and others they hadn't noticed before. They all sat in perfect silence, turned in unison, staring at Josh and Dave. And they were smiling. Dave's voice wavered. "Josh, please tell me you see that." Josh swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his throat. "I see it." Then, movement. Not from the seated figures, from the far end of the car. The door they had just come through was open again. And standing inside the doorway, looking in, were themselves. Josh and Dave. Not reflections, not tricks of the eye. They were watching themselves, frozen in the same terrified stance, their own faces staring back at them. Josh's stomach twisted violently. His other self, the duplicate Josh, blinked. He wasn't supposed to do that. And then, in perfect unison, the two versions of themselves at the other end of the car turned their heads slightly toward the passengers. A slow, mechanical movement. Their lips curled into the same two wide smiles. Dave grabbed Josh's arm, his fingers ice cold. "Go." Josh didn't hesitate. They lunged for the next door. But their doppelgangers moved too. The other Josh and Dave mirrored them exactly, sprinting forward from the opposite side of the train car. The overhead screen flickered violently, the digital text morphing into something unreadable, before finally locking into place. Final destination. The conductor's laugh rumbled through the air, and from behind them, the passengers began to stand up. The passengers rose in eerie synchronization, their joints cracking like dried wood. Their smiles never faltered, eyes locked onto Josh and Dave as if they had been waiting for this moment. Josh ripped open the next door, yanking Dave through just as the other passengers lurched forward. The door slammed behind them, but this car was different. No seats, no windows, no flickering lights, just an endless black void stretching into infinity. Josh's breath hitched. It was not a train car anymore. It was something else, a corridor of darkness, pulsing like a living thing. Dave's grip on Josh's wrist tightened. "We're running out of places to go, man." Josh turned back toward the door, only to see their duplicates standing on the other side of the glass, grinning. His own eyes, his own face, but wrong. They weren't reflections. They were waiting. Then, a soft chime echoed from above. Josh's gaze snapped to the ceiling. A single emergency exit sign flickered red at the end of the void, a doorway barely visible in the gloom. Dave exhaled shakily. "That's got to be it," a voice whispered behind them, smooth as oil. "Go on then, but remember." They spun. The conductor stood just behind them, his skeletal grin stretched too wide, his hollow eyes staring straight into them. "The train always comes back for what belongs to it." Josh didn't wait. He grabbed Dave's arm, and they sprinted toward the glowing exit. The void beneath them shifted, its surface rippling like something breathing, but they kept running. The red glow of the exit pulsed, the words above it shifting between "step through if you dare" and "one way only." Dave reached it first. He hesitated for half a second, just long enough to see what lay beyond the door. A swirling abyss, a sensation of falling forever. No train tracks, no station, just nothing. Josh's heart slammed against his ribs. "We don't have a choice." The train rumbled violently, the sound distorted, like reality itself was tearing apart. Behind them, the conductor and their twisted duplicates were moving toward them, slow, patient, knowing they had no escape. Dave made the call. He jumped. Josh followed. For a single moment, as his feet left the floor, he felt the weightless terror of falling through nothingness. The train, the passengers, the conductor, everything warped around them. A violent snap. Then, Josh's eyes flew open. The train was gone. They were back. Josh gasped, his body jerking upright. His fingers clutched at something solid. A bench. The station. They were back. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting dull glows over the cracked pavement. The tracks were empty, stretching into the distance like they had never held anything at all. Dave sat beside him, hunched over, breathing hard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Dave exhaled, running a shaky hand down his face. Was it real? Josh wanted to say no, wanted to believe they had blacked out, imagined everything, but then his hand burned. He turned it over. There, etched into his palm, was a faintly burned outline of a punched ticket. His stomach dropped. Shaking, he fumbled for his camera. The battery light still blinked red. The footage indicator showing the recording had never stopped. Dave stared at his own camera. We have proof. Josh's fingers trembled as he pressed play. The footage rolled, grainy but clear, the train appearing from nowhere, the doors sliding open, their own hesitant steps inside. Then as the screen flickered, Josh saw something that made his blood freeze. In the recording, he turned toward the camera, but he never remembered doing that. The screen jittered, showing him staring directly into the lens, eyes hollow, mouth curling into a slow, knowing smile. Dave scrubbed through his own footage. His hands stopped moving. The final seconds of his recording showed them sitting right here, exactly as they were now, except in the video, something sat beside them. A long, thin shadow, a skeletal hand resting on the bench. And then, the conductor leaned forward, grinning, and waved. And then, in the final seconds of the recording, the conductor's voice whispers directly into the mic. See you on the next ride. The video cut to black. The station fell silent. Josh's breath hitched. A chime echoed through the air. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a whistle rolled across the empty tracks. Dave swallowed hard. Josh. The neon arrival board above them flickered to life, displaying a new message. Midnight train, on time. A gust of cold wind rattled the station, and far, far down the tracks, a single headlight appeared. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.